Welcome to the 9th video in this character creation series. And in the last video, we took a look at scaling our character so that the dimensions of the mesh match a physical real world dimension. And now we're going to be taking a look at Marvelous Designer. So we've already drafted some patterns for our clothing, and I've actually gone and created a new outfit that I want to make that I've drafted patterns for. And that's what I'm going to be using here. So I've opened the software. I do have a few things that happen by default here when I open the software, which include the fact that I don't have an avatar. And I have already gone and pre-configured a few things that are just saved in my daily preferences. I'd like to point those out before I go any further. So first, inside of settings and under user settings, I've gone into the view controls and set this to match Maya. This is my preferred method of input, and it means that navigating the 3D world is going to be a little bit more familiar to me. I've also gone into the preferences, and under gizmo, I've set my gizmo to be world coordinates. This is going to ensure that I am actually using a method that I'm more familiar with when it comes to moving things inside of 3D space. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my grid properties here, and I want to set my grid properties to something that makes a little bit more sense. Now, when we did our pattern drafting, we drew on the pattern a little tiny marker that determined how tall the patterns were. We measured them in terms of their dimensions and drew this out. Well, I've gone a little bit of a step further this time around, and I've gone and created a little box in my pattern. I'm going to open up the pattern that I'm going to be creating here in order to show you exactly what I mean. So what I've gone and done is I've gone and created a little box. So here is my pattern. Now, this is what was generated inside of ZBrush using the pattern drafting techniques. There are actually two articles of clothing that are here. There is a jacket, and then there's a waistcoat, a little bit of a piece that hangs down over the character's legs that are both present here. And the piece that I want to call your attention to is this perfect square right in the center of this gap here. Now, this is not a part of my pattern. This is actually something that I created once I'd measured out some of these pieces in order to determine exactly how big this thing was supposed to be. This square is 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters. And I just did that by actually, I think it was this piece here that I determined was actually 10 centimeters across when I was doing my pattern drafting. And that was what gave me the ability to then go and create this. So I'm going to want to make this match inside of Designer. So inside, if we go to our preferences and we go to our grid properties here, inside of the 2D grid, I'm going to set the distance in centimeters to be 10. This is the same unit of measurement that we have inside of our pattern drafted image. And so the next thing that I need to do, obviously, if we're going to be creating clothing for a character, is to bring in my character. So I'm going to go to File, Import, OBJ, and I'm going to go and select my character that I've got in a OBJ folder called Avatar. Now, in the import settings, I'm going to make sure that I'm opening this or adding this to the scene here. Doesn't matter right now because this is empty, but this is a overwrite or add to current is what these two things are here. Because my scene's empty, either one will do the same thing. I'm going to be bringing this in as an avatar, which is what I want. I'm going to allow it to automatically add the arrangement points. Now, this really only works if your character is the right dimensions, the right scale. And since we went through the trouble of scaling our character, that is exactly what we want. Also, it needs to know what unit of measurement we're using to measure our characters. And since we did this in 3ds Max, where 1 unit is 1 centimeter, we are going to be using the centimeter default here. This is what's going to ensure that our character comes in at the right size. I'm also not going to scale the character, let it come in at 100%, and I'm not going to move it or translate it or anything like that. So we can leave all the rest of this as default. And I'm going to hit OK. And my character should pop on screen looking quite similar to the way that she did inside of 3ds Max. Now, I do have something that I need to correct here, or something that I just find is going to make me a little bit more comfortable with looking at this, which is that I just want to make the avatar not white and make it a much darker color. I find this just a little bit easier on the eyes, and I'm not really worried about detail or anything in the avatar. So to do that, I simply went and clicked on the avatar, and the avatar's properties ended up over here in the property editor. So I could go and choose its color right here. Color. Currently, there's no texture assigned to this. If your avatar was already textured, that texture could get preloaded as well, and you would see it in there. But this is all I really need to do. Next, I'm going to bring in the pattern that I created. So I'm going to right-click in my viewport, the 2D viewport, and I'm going to go down to where it says Add Background Image. And here, I'm going to go and load that same file that we just took a look at. And this is it here. And what I need to do now, and this is why it's nice to have that little 10 centimeter square, I can see that I'm actually quite a bit larger than 10 centimeters in here. So this is what's going to allow me to get this jacket to fit. So I'm going to go to the scale, and we can bring this down. Let's try 62%. Go and place this here. I can see that I'm still quite a bit larger. So we'll go to 58%, and we'll go and place this in here. And we're getting close. We're getting close. So it looks like 56 would probably, 56 is too small. So 57 is exactly what I'm after. That's what's going to get this. And again, I don't need to be pinpoint accurate here. I just need it to be kind of as close as I can get it. And that's going to allow me to make sure that this fits the character the way that the block out did inside of ZBrush. Now, the other thing that I'm going to do here, I'm going to go and move this so that it's a little bit more centered in the viewport here and over the character. Now, because of the way that I place these patterns, it's not going to be exact, but I just want to kind of get it close enough. With that done, I'm going to hit OK. Now, at this point, I don't actually even need my grid anymore. So what I can do is I can go into my display, environment, and show 2D grid. I can turn that off. This is going to make it a little bit easier to see what's going on. Now, we're not going to keep the pattern here the entire time that we're using Marvelous Designer. I'm simply going to use this as a means of tracing out my pattern in order to be able to place it on the character the way that I want. I'm going to start with the underlying fabric first. Just like when you get dressed yourself, you start with the elements of clothing that are closest to your body, and you start working your way outwards. And so that's what I'm going to do here. Now, I'm kind of aware of what these pieces are and what they do in the pattern here. But if I were to kind of just show this to you, these two funny pieces in the center at the top, these are the sides of her hips in the waistcoat. And then this is the back of the waistcoat, and this is the front of the waistcoat. So those 5 or 6 pieces make up the waistcoat. Everything else is actually the jacket, with the exception, again, of that little white square. So this is the front of the jacket. This goes around to the side, and then this is the center of the back. This goes over her shoulders, and then these are her sleeves with a little bit of a collar right here. To go and start creating this pattern, I'm going to head up to the toolbar inside of the 2D viewport. Now, there's a toolbar inside of each viewport, and those are tools specific to either viewport. So all of the tools that affect things in 3D are located in the 3D viewport, and all of the things located that adhere to the 2D viewport or that are useful in 2D are going to be located in the top of the 2D viewport. I'm going to head over to the polygonal tool, and I'm going to begin by drawing out my pattern. To do this, I'm not going to try and capture all of the curvature, but I'm merely going to just capture the corners. So I'm going to click where that corner begins. I'm going to find the next corner, the next corner, the next corner, and then go back to the beginning again. Once you've fully completed a shape, once you've closed off a shape, the shape will become completely opaque, and the material that we have selected in our scene is going to be applied to that fabric, and we'll see that panel appear in 3D space, pretty comparable to where it was in 2D space. So if you see the silhouette of my avatar's head here with the panel kind of just covering her eye, that's about what we're seeing kind of here. In order to make this a little bit more usable, right now we can't see our pattern, which makes it a little hard to edit. I'm going to go and edit this material. So I'm going to go click on the material here inside of the fabric tab. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to make its color a little bit darker. I'm going to go with something kind of dusty rose in color. I'm going to go down to also the opacity And I'm just going to reduce the opacity down a little bit. And this is just so that I can see my paneling underneath, or my pattern underneath. With that done, I'm going to go to the second tool and I'm going to click and hold. This is going to open up all of the other tools that exist under this icon. And the one that we're interested in is called the Edit Curve Point. Now, Edit Curve Point allows me to place my cursor on an edge and click and drag to create curvature. This is going to allow us to create all of the unique shapes that are here without really worrying so much about having to add vertices all over the place. And so, again, because this was fairly crudely made inside of ZBrush, I know that the pattern here is not something I need to adhere to 100%. I'm just kind of trying to get close enough to that shape. So there is now my first panel. Now I have a duplicate here. I have one that is going to live in symmetrical space with this one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this panel. I'm going to right click on it, and I'm going to go to Symmetric Pattern with Sewing. When I do this, it's going to copy and allow me to reposition. I'm holding Shift here to snap it to one of these 45-degree angle lines. I'm going to go place it over the counterpart. Now, when I do this, we get a blue outline that surrounds our panel and a little blue line that goes from the center of each panel to one another. What this does, if I go back to my edit panel, is it allows me to manipulate these patterns symmetrically. So whatever changes I make to one will happen to the other. The next thing that I want to do is I want to go and place these on my character where they're supposed to go. So for this, I'm going to use the markers that were automatically placed on our character. I'm going to go into the third icon in the viewport, the 3D viewport, and I'm going to go take a look for the arrangement points. Now, these are a series of little blue dots that were automatically placed on my character. These blue dots actually exist on these green cylinders. So each cylinder here has a series of dots on it. And what these are useful for is they are useful for selecting a panel and going and picking in 3D where you want that panel to go in your character, and it'll go and snap it to that area. It also curves the fabric automatically, which is really, really nice. Now, this is actually sideways from where I want it. This is not exactly where I want this panel to go. And so because of that, I'm going to need to make an edit to it. I'm going to go and rotate this thing and move it down. And I'm going to do the same thing to this one, rotate it this way and move it down. Now, pardon me, at some point, you may realize that your pattern may or may not live here, right? It may become rather difficult while looking at this to figure out, is that where that's supposed to go? I don't remember if it goes there, or perhaps these things are on the other side. Perhaps this goes this way and I need to put it back over here. And this can be rather confusing. It can be, if you're not kind of aware of what it is that you're looking at, it goes this way. So to figure this out, all we really need to do is to go in and actually go and create or open up our original file that we did our pattern drafting from, and we should be able to see where these things go on the pattern drafted piece. So I'm going to go down to my folder. I'm going to go into ZBrush, and I've got my pattern drafting here. So if I go and bring this up, this appears to be the previous pattern that I created. And so we're going to go and hide that. And we'll bring the jacket out, which is also the previous pattern. So it looks like I may not have actually saved this the way that I wanted to. So I don't have my actual original pattern here anymore. So that means that ZBrush is not going to be any use to me. This is something I definitely should have done. And we're going to have to do a little bit of trial and error here now because I didn't remember to save that. So I believe that I had this correct the first time around. that the larger ends here are going to go into the front. Now, in order to kind of show you why I believe this, or why I'm coming to this realization, I'm going to go and create the other two panels here. So I'm going to go back into my polygon tool, and we shall again go and create the other panels here. So I'm going to do a curve to here, corner here, and back in. We will go back into the edit curvature point, and I can go and manipulate the curvature here. I'm going to make this really nice and round, like so. And then this is going to come in, and this is going to straighten out. So I should have a really nice curve through here now. And then this curve here too needs to come in and straighten out a little bit there. I'm not going to worry about the top too much here, as I think that should work the way that it's intended to. And again, I can make edits to these as I go. I'm going to symmetric with sewing here as well, and we'll put this one on the other side. And then I'll go and create the other panel while I'm at it. So this one is going to start here and here. And again, we're going to have a curve to about here, a point here, a point here, and we'll close this off. And again, I'll go and add the curvature. And this one I'm going to curve outwards just a little bit on the symmetrical edge. And then I will go and symmetrically sew this one as well over here. So I now have the three pieces that I'm going to need to create this. What I need to do is now place these in front of my character. So I know that these two are the rear ones. We're going to bring back our placement points again. So I'm going to start with the one on this side, which I can place here. Let's put it here. And again, it's kind of curving around the character the wrong way. I think at this point, it makes a little bit more sense to now orient these panels the way that I want them to. I'm just going to rotate them here. We're going to move them. We're going to move them aside. So there's the rear panel. And I'll move these ones aside here as well. And rotate. And then this is going to be the front panel. So I'm going to go and place this one over here. And then we can go and grab these two and place them over here. And you can see why my inclination here is that these things go this way, is that I can actually see the curvature here where this is going to fit. Like so. So there, that makes up the waistcoat. Now, the reason that I want to place these in this way has to do with two separate things. First, I'm thinking of the flow of the directionality of the fabric here. You know, how I would actually cut this out of real fabric. Now, when I placed the pattern inside of this 0 to 1 box, or when I made this square texture, I was just trying to fill the space as best I could. In terms of actually laying out my fabric, this makes more sense to me in the way that it's going to be laid out. This is also going to allow me now to better position these points in a way that is going to make them fit in the way that I want them to. So we're going to put that one there and that one there. We'll take these ones and drop them down even further. Maybe something like that. I'm just going to pull them down a little bit. And actually, they're on the wrong side. That one goes there. There we go. Okay, so those fit a little bit better with where I want them. Now to go and place these ones, which are going to fit here. So we can get rid of our points now. Now that we don't need them, I can get rid of the arrangement points. I'm going to go make my fabric opaque again, since I don't need to see through it over here. And what I want to do now is I want to stitch these things together. I've got them placed around the character where I want them to be. but I haven't gone and actually solidified them or made them actual proper fabric yet. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go, there are 4 sewing machine icons down here at the bottom. The first is to select stitching. The second one is to create a edge to edge stitch. The next one is for free stitching, which allows you to stitch around corners and past vertices. And then the final one is to check the sewing length of your edges. So I'm going to go into the segment stitching, and I'm going to segment stitch these things together in the order that they're meant to be sewn. And I can double check here in 3D that the edges are my sewing. These are the threads here that it's generating in this color, that they're actually going from A to B in a straight line. They're not crisscrossing over each other. I can also, with the segment sewing tool, select in 3D where I want these things to be stitched. So if you're having a hard time with your pattern, figuring out, oh, where did this go? What was this supposed to have done? Going through and doing it in 3D will ensure that it does actually line up the way that you want. Okay, now with that, I have my pattern created here, and the next step is to simulate it on the character. There are 3 different types of simulation that we can choose from here. I'm going to click and hold on the simulation button. The first is to use your GPU, to use your video card to simulate. The next one is to use your CPU. This is the normal simulation. And then finally, we have a complete nonlinear simulation. This is what's going to give us the most accurate simulation. I'm going to use GPU for now because I have a pretty high-end video card, and it's going to handle the simulation pretty quickly. I'm going to hit the simulate button and let this thing drape on the character the way that it was meant to. And there is now that waistcoat that is going to sit underneath the jacket that she wears. So right out of the gate, this is looking a lot like I intended it to look. But again, that should make sense because this was generated in 3D. I kind of sculpted something in ZBrush, made it look the way that I wanted it to look, and generated my pattern from that. So it only makes sense that the pattern now looks the way that it should here. Now, while you're simulating, you can actually click and drag and move the fabric. And the fabric is pretty low poly at the moment. I'm going to hit spacebar to turn off the simulation, and I'm going to go and select my panels here. And I can see that what I've got right now, when I select all of these things, in terms of my simulation properties, this has a particle distance of 20 millimeters. Now, a particle distance is kind of like an inverted polygon count. What this number means is that each vertex on the geometry here has a maximum distance of 20 millimeters from its neighbor. So what this allows us to do is it allows us to get this fabric to be pretty high poly, but it limits it. It's not like when in 3ds Max you add a turbo smooth and like 19 iterations. This has a limit. We can only make the vertices get so close together. So what I'm going to do is this is the default here, 20, and you can actually go into the properties and change which distance you want to be your default. 20 seems to work fairly well, which is why I've left it that way. And I'm going to go and drop it by half to 10. And when I do that, we're not really going to see too much change here, and that's because the simulation was off. And even if the simulation was running, going and changing that distance actually will turn off the simulation. So I'm going to hit spacebar to turn it back on. And again, we're kind of getting a little bit cleaner simulation in here. The next thing that I want to do is I want to set up the fabric. I want to set up how this thing actually is supposed to look. So if I select my fabric here, we're only just using default settings on this. And that's not what I want. I don't want a just default paneling here, a default fabric. I want to make sure that what I'm getting is actually the look that I'm after. So if I wanted this to be leather, I'm going to make sure that it's supposed to be leather. And so that's what I'm going to be after here. So inside of the fabric, I've gotten on and selected this. I'm going to go to its physical properties, and there's a preset drop down here that we can go and create or use any of the presets that ship with the software. And we can do one of two things. We can actually go and create our own preset here, or select one of these built-in presets, or we can create our own, and that's by opening up the details pane and going and playing with all of these properties until the fabric behaves the way that we want it to behave. Now, I found that there's kind of a little bit of a middle ground here, that I don't just use one or the other of these. I find that what I typically do is I will go and choose a preset that is closest to the way that I would like this to behave. And then I go back and start manipulating the settings if it doesn't look the way that I want it to look. So this is actually meant to be a little bit of a felt twill kind of fabric. Essentially, I'm thinking of very high-end suit material kind of thing. So in my presets here, I'm going to go and choose cotton twill. And you'll see that right away, this changes the way that the fabric is behaving. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to select the entirety of my pattern. I'm going to right click on it, and I'm going to go to the layer clone, and I'm going to make an under layer clone. Now, what an under layer clone is going to do, I'm just going to go and hold shift and put this above my paneling here. This is an exact copy of our material or of our panels. However, they are stitched 100% to the originals. So this is not adding thickness. This is not an internal thing. I'm not going to be exporting this when I bring this into Max. But what this is going to do when I simulate is it's going to make the fabric behave a little bit more like fabric, in that it's not just a individual piece of fabric now, but it is something that is stitched all the way around. You can see that this is giving us a little bit of a better looking seam down the middle where these panels are sewn to each other. And again, I can go and select these panels, and I'm going to drop my resolution down even further. This time we're going to go to 5 and simulate. And again, we'll let that fabric come to rest. You can see here that we're getting a lot of pass-through where the internal pieces, these ones, are simulating in front of the others. So this is a fairly easy thing to fix. I'm just going to go and pull on the outer fabric, and I want to make sure that it is the right one that I'm pulling on, just to go reset these back. And the more you do this, the more it'll start to figure out which is supposed to be in front and which is not. We can also try and set our layering up here to make this work. If I select all of the outer panels and go to layer and hit 1 and hit enter, this should shove all of the internal stuff back in automatically. I just want to make sure if I do that I remember to put it back to 0 when I'm done. And that's because that can actually increase your performance, have everything on one layer, not having the layers active. And so we're getting somewhere here with the waistcoat. I'm pretty pleased with how this is sitting on her. I might want to go and just make sure that it stays a little bit more symmetrical in terms of where this waistline is. I'm going to end up with a belt covering the transition between the jacket and this waistcoat anyway. But that looks to me to be pretty good. Once I'm happy with the simulation, and I would do this for each article of clothing here. I would do the jacket, and I would do her pants, and so on all the way through this. I'm going to do just a simple individual piece of clothing so that we can see the entire process here without this being, a good 20-hour video of me going through and doing clothing. I'm pretty pleased with the way that this is working, so I'm going to do a couple of things here to finalize my simulation. First, I'm going to turn off the simulation. I'm going to select my avatar, and while this isn't actually an issue at the moment, I know in some cases on this paneling it actually would be. What's going to happen is the nature of the low poly avatar that I'm using is going to start affecting the clothing. Meaning, if I get really, really, really high resolution clothing simulated on a really, really low resolution avatar, what's going to happen is we're going to be able to see the vertices in the avatar sticking through. So, with the avatar selected, I'm going to go into the property editor again, find miscellaneous, and I'm going to open up the smooth avatar and turn that on. This is going to subdivide the model and give us a little bit higher resolution. I'm going to bring this up to 2, just based off the topology I have. I probably don't want to go any denser than that. Anything further than that, and I'm going to really be impacting performance. The next thing that I want to do is I'm going to want to go into the simulation and go to complete nonlinear. This is going to make sure that we get the most accurate simulation that we want for this. And then finally, I'm going to bring my particle distance down to 3. Now, when you bring it down to 3, anything below 5 millimeters, it's going to warn you that there is going to be some severe slowdown. And being that I'm in the highest quality version of the simulation, you're going to see that this is going to actually be the case. So we're going to wait for it to scale the mesh or retopologize the mesh. And I'm going to go and hit simulate. And I'm going to actually have to give this a minute or two before it actually does anything. Now, if I go and watch the little tiny wrinkles of details and things that are here, we should be able to see whether or not this has actually been simulated and whether or not it's doing anything. I'm going to go and rotate the camera so I can see the back. I know that there's a few kind of longer pleats back here. And I just kind of want to wait for it to settle, right? So it simulates and it's going to move, and then you want to kind of have it come to rest so that it stops moving. Okay, I'm going to stop the simulation and just go and check out what it looks like. And I'm pretty pleased with the way that it's looking. I'm getting some really nice kind of smaller pleats in here. I can see the detail that's being caused by the fact that the paneling is sewn together. I'm getting some really nice stuff in the back in terms of where this is kind of hanging and draping over her body. This is exactly what I want. My next goal is to get this into 3ds Max. If we were to look at the topology here, we're going to see that the topology is not really useful. We're in random triangles kind of all over the place on this mesh. And this is actually quite useful for doing fabric simulation, but it's not going to be useful for bringing this inside of ZBrush. Now, there are some things that you can do inside of Designer. There is the ability to go and change under miscellaneous your mesh type from triangle to quad, though depending on the shape of your fabric, sometimes it can't actually make it all quadded. And so I find it better to go and do this a little bit more manually to have a little bit more control over how this is occurring or how this is happening. So I'm pleased with this. This looks pretty decent. The other thing that we want to do is go and manipulate the UVs. So there is a UV editor in here. And because I really like the layout that I've got for the panel right here, in fact, the only thing that I would probably change would be to bring this thing over here. And again, make sure I don't have any overlap. This is giving me a pretty decent rectangle, right? Which looks like I'll be able to pack it pretty cleanly when doing UVs. So in order to go edit my UVs, I'm going to go from the simulation tab in the top right to UV editor. And what we should see is essentially the layout that I had just a moment ago, but they're not in the 0 to 1 box. And I'm just going to move them over there. And that's it. I'm not going to worry about the clone. We're going to go back into simulation mode. And now that I have this done, I'm going to go back and look at our fabric the right way on this one. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to spit this out of Marvelous Designer so that we can go and start editing it or manipulating it inside of 3ds Max. So this is the only panel or set of panels that I want to export. I'm not going to worry about the clone. I don't need those in any way. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to File, Export, OBJ selected, and I'm going to go and create a folder here. I'll just call this Demo so we can track these OBJs. So this is the Waistcoat _ sim or simulated. Now, this is really important to my process, is that I need to make sure that this is coming out as a single object, that it is not welded. So welding, what that's going to do, if you choose welding, is wherever your panels meet each other, the vertices are going to become one. And I can't, the process that I do in 3ds Max is absolutely impossible if you weld together. So we need to make sure it's unwelded. I'm also going to make sure that it's thin. So I don't want the software to generate thickness for the fabric. I'm going to manually do that inside of 3ds Max where I have more control. And then finally, unified UV coordinates. I also want to make sure that my scale is the same as when we imported the avatar, right? Centimeters and 100%. I'm going to hit OK. And I'm going to go and let that enter, get saved inside of the software. The next thing that I need to do is I'm really going to be concerned here when I get into ZBrush. There are two things from Marvelous Designer that I would like to maintain. The first is the shape. I really love these tiny little wrinkles and pleats and features that I'm getting from the software. The other thing that I want to keep is the UVs. Because this is simulated from this as a piece of fabric, the UVs on this are 100% accurate. That would mean if I were to put a checkerboard on here, we would actually see where it's being pulled tight. The checkers would actually be stretched just a little bit in that area. That means that when we go to put fabric material on here, that stretch is going to apply the same way, which is exactly what we want. So I need to be able to get both the UVs and the simulation out of here and into ZBrush. Now, I've seen a lot of people that use just the simulation, bring it into ZBrush and Z-remesh it. As soon as you do that, your UVs are gone. And while you can unwrap the Z-remeshed topology, you end up actually not getting exactly the same UVs. That stretch tends to be gone. And so we're going to do this in a way that's going to make sense. So before I do anything, I'm going to go into Max and I'm going to go and import my avatar. So we're going to go back to this Star Trek folder. I'm going to go back into my OBJ folder and grab my avatar. This is the one that the clothing had been simulated upon in Marvelous Designer. So there she is there. And I'm going to also go and import what I just exported. So import, we're going to go up and we're going to go to our demo folder and Waistcoat sim. And this should appear, because we use the same measurements everywhere, exactly where it was inside of Marvelous Designer on the character. Brilliant. The next thing that I need to do is to be able to maintain my UVs inside of 3ds Max. So while that waistcoat has UVs and the shape is correct, the topology isn't. And as soon as I retopologize, I'm going to lose my UVs. So I want a way of gaining back my UVs, of getting back what I'm going to lose when I retopologize. To do that, I'm going to go and hit this button here, Reset 2D Arrangement in my 3D viewport. This is going to put the paneling back in the shape of what it looks like in the 2D editor. Now, I still only have the one copy selected, and I'm going to say File, Export OBJ selected. I'm going to put it in the same folder with the same name, only instead of Sim, I'm going to call this Flat, because this is now the UV version of this. The settings have to remain identical between both exports. Single object, unwelded, thin, unified UV coordinates, and making sure that I'm still in centimeters at 100%. I'm going to hit OK. And then, because I want my simulation back, I'm going to hit Control Z. And that'll snap the fabric back to where it was on the model. At this point, I'm going to return to 3ds Max and import the flattened version of the fabric. There it is there. Now I'm going to make a change to the fabric here. If I go to my top view, I can see that it's quite a ways away from the 0 line, and this is going to make retopology a little bit of a pain in the butt. So I'm going to go and grab that topology. I'm just going to grab all the vertices. Now I'm moving the vertices here, not the object, and that's going to ensure that the pivot point doesn't move. I'm just going to get these really close to that 0 line while still remaining behind it, like so. And so there, I now have two copies of the fabric. I've got one that the shape is right, and one that I can use to actually do a planar projection to get my UVs. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to select the main article of clothing, the simulated one, and I'm going to place a modifier upon this called Morpher. Using an empty slot, I'm going to right-click and pick from Scene and click the flat version of the software, or the panels. Now what this modifier does is, because these two articles of clothing, even though one is on the body and wrinkled and one is beside the body and flat, they share topology, which means I can morph from one into the other. Now, when you're pleased that that works correctly, you can delete the flattened version And that's where we're going to stop here. The idea now is to get this done with every article of clothing on your character until you get to the point that you have everything ready to go inside of 3ds Max. In the next video, I'm going to take a look at the act of retopologizing this outfit so that we can make our new low-res subdivision level 1 of the clothing. Until then, we'll talk soon.